Hello. First of all, thanks to Andreu, who presented beautiful slides. My role is much easier, and I will take another approach to what we have achieved within Strategic Advisory Forum. We were putting the questions, and the questions are the following. First question, why we need new territorial agenda? Of course, megatrends are changing. Last one from Gödele was from 2011 and until 2020. Then this last one was academically perfect, but as policy driver, very limited impact. And finally, wish to use capacity of European space. All of us in this room think that it is important. Then what, moving ahead, in our Strategic Advisory Forum, we put question, what challenges? And you had already by Kai, by Andreu, by others, told that fragmentation of Europe, which is bringing us that many problems which are special in nature, growing interdependencies, so what is happening in remote places in Europe often is impacted by something happening in China or far away, and functional mismatches. It means that we are playing policies using administrative divisions, but of course real life is happening within functional organization. Functional spaces, and it makes a problem for policy making. Then we moved to scenarios, and scenarios are medium and long term. In medium term, it seems that we all in Europe are extremely pessimistic. What seems extremely optimistic some time ago, now it's average scenario. And that's the way how Andreu and others were presenting that muddling through is the most probable scenario. But we thought that successful cooperation could be included more and more because it was always declared as priority and clear plus-sum game coming out of embracing spatial dimension. And then moving is possible on later stage to global balance so that Europe is answering challenges, making necessary structural adjustment and local renaissance. Then for whom? Next question. And of course, we have feeling often that we have to go through with politicians, but spatial structure are changing very slowly. It means that often politicians who have political horizon of 2-3 years winning next election, they do not care simply. And Simin said something very important during one of the sessions, that we should approach society as much as possible. Of course, with social media, it is often possible what was impossible some time ago. But of course, coming to society, we need better language, better wording. It cannot be that scientific as we are used to. Then the fifth question was what to do. And of course, I liked very much this expression that place-sensitive narrative we have to build, and mostly this is soft impact, so we are promoting different ways of facilitating different processes. And finally, last question, how to achieve shared European vision. And we are coming to the point that we are building on 3 levels. Very ambitious, which would be our dream, just ambition, and just to survive as a field of intervention, bringing additional value out of our activities. That's the state of art in 7 minutes or so. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. I'm just going to pass over to Kai, who had one particular conclusion or point he'd like to raise in light of the discussions earlier on.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And once again, thank you for the workshop. I think you have done more than what you actually believe you have done, in particular following on what Jacek just said. Because the big question for the project is, in the end, what is the key message to be delivered to a territorial agenda post-2020? So what is the contribution we can make there, and what would we recommend to them? And following on the entire discussion about territorialism, which we translate into the misalignment and the interdependency, saying that very much links to that kind of the places left behind, which for us kind of translate into the fragmentation challenges, and saying, well, what we see as answers is very much different types of cooperation. Andreas, you talked about kind of the soft approaches to working together and doing things, and kind of linking different places up to it. And I think that's what we tried in the workshop, to get really insights. What is going on already? What is out there? Are we just kind of making nice theories around things, or how do you see things from your experience? And I think for me there are kind of two conclusions to be drawn. The one is, I think there is a lot of things going on already, and we maybe need to be better in highlighting that and kind of thinking about, we mentioned in the project, kind of in the workshops, the upscaling. How can we make sure that this is transferred and more used? Also think about some of the obstacles, those experience that we have faced, which is often linked to the time-bound project-oriented approach under which a lot of things work nowadays. Which would mean a little bit we have those challenges, and the answer is kind of becoming better on what we are doing already, if I now kind of overstretch it a little bit. Which then of course poses the question to me, do we need maybe to think much more radically different? As kind of, are we too tame to actually draw conclusions? And I think that links for me also to what you said, Semini, early. Kind of the value bases have changed since we looked into ESDP and things. So question is also, if we give advice to a territorial agenda, what is actually the idea of a possible future Europe that people that draft the territorial agenda have in the back of their head? And I think, Simon, you made a few hints in that direction. So question mainly is, do we just need to become better on what we do, because we do already a lot? And if we become better at finally also kind of change things? Or do we need to step back and say, wait a moment, we have done that, we have been there, we need a radically different approach and need to start from scratch in what we actually want? And I think that became also very clear that kind of we could do both ways. The question is, what is most sensible and what would you recommend?
Right. Do you want to answer that question posed to you, Jacek, or shall I go to the audience?
Go to the audience.
Go to the audience. Right then. So I'm coming. Oh, okay. Oh, Andreas, go for it. Yeah, yeah. By all means, pass that one down to him. Yeah, yeah.
Good. Thank you.
Should be on.
Should be on. Okay. Good. Thank you. May I report something that's happened during the meetings? Muddling through was perceived as something negative, and I was pointing out as a one-time planning theorist that muddling through is a respectable strategy. Yes? There has been a book called The Science of Muddling Through. Yeah? It's a recognition of limitations of our possibilities and so forth and so forth. Enough said about this topic, but muddling through is not necessarily negative. Second point is a place-based approach. We are not the first ones to talk about it, but a place-based approach, there are two things to be said about it. First of all, it is opposed to a territorial approach. Yeah? Places define themselves and they disregard borders. There are places within territories and there are places which cross territorial boundaries. Yeah? So there's an inherent conflict. It's the conflict that I was talking about. Yeah? The conflict between a place-based approach on the one hand and a territorial approach on the other. As far as this is concerned, the territorial agenda is a vague concept, a problematic concept. Third point, who is interested in maintaining territories? Yeah? Well, it's those who derive benefits from representing territories, for working for territories, and potentially with a place-based approach, we are going to clash with those. Yeah? And it's built into the concept of space. Yeah? Patsy Healy's pointed this out very nicely in her book about place from 2010. Yeah? Place making, she calls it. And she says very clearly, place making cross-cuts institutional boundaries. So we have to take account of that.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. I'm coming now to the audience for questions or comments about anything that's been raised here or been raised in the workshops. So I'm going to come to this gentleman here in the middle first, and then I'm coming to the back there. Let's take a round. So those of you on the panel here, please take note of what's said.
Hello, Frederik Richters from the Luxembourg Ministry of Spatial Planning, as of this morning. I'm wondering whether we really need a new narrative. I mean, this morning was all about how the old narrative maybe is not up to date anymore, how we need to think about the changing value bases. I'm wondering whether the problem lies with the communication of the narrative, that we actually do have a good narrative, that territorial cohesion is still valid, that we're just not doing a good point in selling it and making people realize that the EU is actually there to help them and that it is one of the objectives of the EU and that more can be done in this respect.
Okay, excellent. To the back, I saw a hand at the back there somewhere. Wherever you were, you can raise your hand once more. Super. So the person with the microphone. It is.
Well, Kai offered us two alternatives. We either go with what we already do, try and improve that, or something radically different. I read the last discussion, the discussion document, which went to the last meeting of this group. And what I'd say was that what we usually do now on territorial development comes under the heading in the member states of planning. Spatial planning, urban planning, environmental planning. But planning's not mentioned once in your discussion document. So I must inevitably conclude that you're looking for something, a radical change, to move away from the things we already do, which is planning. Perhaps you need more planners on the group.
I'll pick up the microphone as a planner. Yes, I am obviously by qualification and profession a proud fellow of the Royal Town Planning Institute. So speaking about that last point about planning, I think I agree with Vincent that some of the things that we're discussing here, in some countries, planners assume the responsibility for doing that. But there are a whole host of issues, even in the UK, with 100 years of sort of tradition of planning, to the extent that some people have started to say planning is too important to be left to planners. So, because when we talk about planning and planners, the ideal image that we have from what planners do is not always, doesn't always match with what planners do on a day-to-day practice. And we're talking about UK with a particular sort of claim to spatial planning. In some other countries, I think what people understand from planning is sometimes is urban design, sometimes is planning jobs are done by architects. I mean, no disrespect to architects, but they're not there to kind of do all these coordination and territorial development and so on. So to some extent, I agree that in many places, this is the discourse of spatial planning, everything that we talk here, but not everywhere. And to even thinking about the UK, I'm afraid I have to say that some of our planners are really bogged down with the procedures. The substance is disappearing. And I mean, there are lots of planners out there, including myself, who are still fighting for giving planning a better voice, understanding planning as a coordinating, place-based coordination of policies and so on. But what is really happening every day in planning offices is far from that. It's unfortunate, but it's what is happening, yeah. So,
Simeon, could I
just
also ask
to
you
go back to the planning issue.
to also have a go at answering the other question?
Oh, yes, yeah.
Because it ties
About
into what you
selling
said on
it.
the earlier panel, and then I'll come to the other
That's
speakers.
right. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Well, I'll just quickly say what I was trying to say. I was trying to say that the whole idea of territorial agenda and cohesion came out because of a particular social democratic way of thinking about the world, which was saying that we do not want to live in a world which is so unequal. And this is the question that everybody should be asking themselves. What kind of Europe do we want to see in the future? Do we want to see a Europe which is polarized, and we saw some of the figures? So that's the first question. Or do we want a Europe which is more, if you like, harmonious, has less, the inequalities are not so sharply into a polar situation? So that's the first question we need to ask. But then the second thing, which is more difficult. So I suppose if you ask that question, a lot of people would just say, oh yes, we all want cohesion. But then the second question is that, how do we get there? And that's where you will see very different, radically different answer to that question. Because if you ask that question from one of Mrs. Thatcher's ministers, he would say, it is better if we invest in places that are a huge amount of, we get the return from them. I even have a quote somewhere in my papers from Economist, which said, fairness has nothing to do with territorial development. It's much better if we put all our resources into London, because that's where you get the best return. It's the point that Andreas was also making. And then the wealth that is created in London will trickle down and reach Newcastle, where I live. Well, I've been waiting for that trickle down for the last 20 years, hasn't reached me yet. So that's one way of thinking, okay? But there is another way of thinking, which has been the European way until recently, that if you want Newcastle to be lifted, you have to proactively do something about it. You can't wait for the trickle down coming from London. But can I just say that you have to invest in those places. But by investment, I do not necessarily mean what we've been doing in EU, which is compensatory transfer of money from the rich to the poor. That is not the meaning of place-sensitive or place-based approach. It's not about taking from the rich and giving it. It's not a Robin Hood sort of policy. It is about tailor-made place-sensitive policies. So you look at Newcastle, you see what can we do in this specific place to help it, which is going to be different from a city in Spain, from another city in Portugal. So it's the thing that somebody said, you listen first, you study first. So it's not sort of one policy fits every places. It's about fitness for purpose. It's about thinking about the place and then coming up. This does not happen, certainly doesn't happen in UK. Andres, before he left, he made a very good point about interest rate, and I know that. The way that the Bank of England set the interest rate often benefits London and financial institutions. It doesn't necessarily benefit places that are still doing a lot of manufacturing. So these are very significant differences that policymaking should make. And the European Commission should do it this way as well. It's not about just giving people money. It's about building capacity in those places to actually be able to use the money. So certainly that's what I mean by place-sensitive policymaking. I'm not talking about distributing money around. That could be, money is part of it, but it's not the answer to all the problems.
If you can just pass the mic over. So I'm just going to come to each of the speakers for a final 1 minute. Pass it down that way. Sorry. Thank you very much. So be speedy, please. 1 minute each for the
Yes.
four of you.
I just want to address briefly Vincent Nadin's concern about the lack of planners, of the small, non-existent role of spatial planners in this. Well, it's the planners themselves who are to blame for this, because during the ESDP process, they insisted on spatial planning not being a competence of the European Union. They hammered this all the time, especially the Germans did, but practically all the other, at that time, 14 other member states followed. So the Commission got fed up, and they introduced simply a new discourse in terms of territorial cohesion, yeah? Of which the Commission would always claim now that it is different from spatial planning, which is, of course it is not, yeah? But this is the state of the game, the blame game, yeah? And therefore it is inopportune at the moment to mention spatial planning or town planning in this context, because the Commission would immediately say it's one of the forbidden words, actually, to say spatial planning in the context of the EU. That's the reason, and no other reason. There's no material difference, to my mind, between what spatial planners, good spatial planners, are doing or should be doing, on the one hand, and what territorial cohesion policy makers should be doing. But these things are simply important, and you explain them through history. And it was actually a French takeover. It was under Barnier and being advised by Dattard, articulating specific French concerns. And so territorial cohesion came into the picture.
When we started to work together, having these brilliant minds on our side, there were two warnings which, in my opinion, were important for us. First is that often we observe approach against what is in papers, one solution fits all. So if we have in Poland relatively decentralized system of structural funds absorption, we have 16 regions which are very different from each other. But the approach applied was very much the same, to have, let's say, the same share of certain spendings. And that's not fair. That's not solving the problem of development. And then the second, after crisis, we observe in Europe 7 years of increasing disparities. So cohesion is not happening. But after 1 year, when it slightly decreased, in cohesion report it was declared that cohesion is back on track. That's oversimplification, but we think that we have to move to roots of cohesion. Thank you.
Right, excellent. I'm going to pass the mic. Oh, actually, you have a mic in front of you. Go for it.
I don't know if
with three at the same time, go for it.
I don't know if we are talking too much here. Anyway, I would like to come back to the first question concerning if I understood this question right, what's new from the narrative we are testing today with you in relation to the narratives of the previous territorial agenda? To what extent we need something new? And in my view, what we are saying, which is new, is the emphasis on the crisis of territorialism. So what the previous territorial agenda were advocating for territorial cooperation, they were advocating for territorial cohesion, for the territorialization of European policies. All of this is right, so nothing is wrong. But today, what we see, because of the fragmentation, but also because of the interdependencies, because of the growing importance of digital monopolies, for instance, what we see is a crisis of territorialism that Andreas was talking before. And the crisis of territorialism means that maybe we agree on the policies, but we have to agree as well on the policy design process, who is intervening in these policies, and how these policies are going to be implemented, because of the complexity of the administrative and political fragmentation of Europe. In a way, what is new on the narrative we are testing with you today is this emphasis This emphasis on the problems we have in Europe because of this complex territorialism we're still living in, which is different from Asia, which is different from Latin America, from North Africa. So the scenarios in the future we are imagining is ways to overcome territorialism. In the long term, we may advocate the post-territorialist view of Andreas Faludi for the long term, or the new territoriality, let's say reforms of territoriality like Europe, the European Union becoming actually a common, strong institution able to deal with digital monopolies, with the regulations of robotics, of biomedicine, of financial global markets. So the integration of regulations in Europe, this could be the creation of a new territoriality. Also could be the reforms in Denmark, that they amalgamate municipalities, they change the competences and financing levels of the different administrative scales and so on. So we can imagine a reform, a deep reform on the territories we have. But this is also for the long term. For the next 10 years, what we are advocating in the narrative is how to improve the modeling through a scenario we are now, because it's not completely wrong, as Andreas said, but it has a lot of risks. Can be right, can be wrong. So disintegration, increasing fragmentation, this is a likely outcome of just a modeling through reactionary policy. So we are overemphasizing the need for cooperation at all scales in Europe as a main priority. This was part of the previous territorial agendas, but maybe now, because we are more conscious of this territorialism, this crisis of territorialism, we are emphasizing even more cooperation. Not because it's heaven. I mean, maybe we need integration in 10, 15 years in many policies. Maybe we need synergies, not just cooperation, but cooperation seems the pragmatic and more possible way for the next 10 years. I don't know if you buy these arguments, but this is more or less what we are, I say, trying to test with you today, to what extent this works.
Okay, well, first of all, congratulations to Luxembourg to having a Ministry of Spatial Planning as of today. So, well done. And I think you hit quite the point, Frederick, saying it's a lot about communication. And that is also what we had in the project discussion. If we really want to move to a place-sensitive decision-making and want to address the key challenges, who does actually need to be aware and change things? And if you really think about that, we are very quickly out of the usual circles of planners. We are very quickly out of the circles of cohesion policy even, because we are going into much more substantial issues. And that's kind of where, for me, the communication challenge lies. We need to think in addressing decision makers at a much higher level, because the topics are far beyond what planning or cohesion policy do. In the project, we tried, at one point, we even got a meeting with Commissioner Oettinger to say, kind of, can we discuss those things? We had a meeting, I guess that's what we can say. But I think that is actually, for me, the level of ambition. We would need to become, in communication, as good as kind of not only ministers in our spheres, but people in completely different spheres understand those things and can say, we can adjust our multi-annual financial framework or our national policy or politics here. So we need to become much better in communication. I guess, Vincent, that's also why the planning terminology has disappeared, even though it's planning topics, because then we automatically are put in the box of, oh, you should talk to the town planner over there in Esch or Heisdorf or wherever it is. And I think that's where we need to find the trick at the moment, to see, can we formulate it in a way that it talks beyond our circles, and by that also get the message across what is going on already to solve those things. Thank you.
Right, excellent. That draws that panel to a close. So a round of applause for all of our extra panelists here up on the stage. Thank you very much indeed to all of you.